What I check all for, but they're not the. See how to
This is incredibly interesting. And notice how quiet most classes are before they get started. Everyone's on their phone. No one's talking to each other, and I can't even get people's attention in here. Great. I actually really appreciate that, because we don't see that enough post-COVID. We don't see people engaging with us. How difficult this project is and how much we all hate.
No, I don't hate the player, I hate the game.
So I wanted to start out today's class with a little bit of optimism, because I see how stressed out people are. I see how difficult this is, and I want to acknowledge just how many new things I am throwing at you all at the same time. For a lot of you, you're dealing with a lot of new technologies, a lot of new ideas, a lot of you haven't seen before. And just, I did a quick monitoring of Discord this weekend, to see, take the temperature of each team, figure out who's doing what, how much communication, what are people working on, and I'm seeing a lot of effort. And I'm seeing a lot of effort from a reasonable number of people, but note that that is not everybody. And in fact, I have heard from some people that they are a little bit concerned about their overall group's ability to work together and all communicate and make progress. So just keep an open ear as you are talking as a group, just to make sure that your group feels like you're putting in effort, that you're all communicating together. This is a project where you will all need to take that leadership role at some time or another. There's no real way to hide in the background. There's no time to let other people make all of the decisions and then just go along with it. You will need to be a loud voice in order for on those peer reviews to feel like your teammates can hear you. They see your effort. They know what you're working on. They see that technical contribution. So please just make sure that that is you in your team. And if that is a frustration that you have in your team, please make sure to communicate that with them, because we are 2 days out from a client meeting. And we need to at least have something together where the client can give you some feedback and say, yes, this is what I asked for, or I have some concerns about the final product. You want your code on Wednesday to represent a prototype or a design for what you're going to submit Sunday night. It doesn't all have to be there, but the more you can put there, the better the client will be able to give you that feedback. So I want to talk a little bit about how Wednesday's going to work. Yeah, that's first.
Quick question.
Yeah,
The rubric mentions use of the Kanban board. Are you calling that the issue
that's
board?
the issue board. Yeah, the issue tracker. So in general, a Kanban board is a place where you can, it has 3 main components. It has a task list. So kind of a tasks that need to be done, tasks that are in progress, and tasks that have been completed. And all of those are for the sprint at large. And then that's exactly what the issue tracker does. You allow, you make a task, you assign that task to a developer, and then that task becomes a completed issue. That it simulates that idea.
Just maybe for future reference, the projects tab has an actual ability to make an actual like
Board, it looks like that. Yeah,
I don't know how tough it is to set up.
yeah, it's not too bad. Very, very good for future. Other questions? All right, Wednesday is gonna look very similar to last week's lab, that all of you are going to have time to work in your teams. We'll find some order where you will have about 20 minutes to meet with Tony and introduce yourselves, show him what you've been working on. But I want to give you a little bit of an idea, because it might be worth talking to your team about how you want to actually do this. Part of that grade is going to be professionalism. This does not require you to dress up, or, I'm not worried about the visual aspect of professionalism. I am more so concerned with the interpersonal relation portion of this, because it doesn't matter what clothing you're in when you do this. It's all about what you say, how you say it, how you structure that presentation of the code to make the client feel valued, to make the client feel like there's some kind of interpersonal, you've developed this professionally for the client. So please don't feel the need to dress up. You can if you'd like to. Not saying you can't, but it's not going to be a part of the grade or part of the professionals. So think about if you put out the request for some code to be developed, and the team comes in to present it to you and just slaps their laptop down in front of you and says, go. Is that professional? What would you change about that to come across as more professional? I can make it worse. You can slap the laptop and, well, that sucked. Turn around and walk away. Think about, is it worth introducing yourself? Is it worth going through kind of a verbal, here's how you interact with the program? But you don't want to hold the leash of the client, because this application needs to be able to stand alone without having a developer standing over the client's side saying, no, do this, not that. Something along those lines. So your documentation should speak for itself. It might be worth the client actually installing it for themselves from the README. Maybe that would be useful as a way of saying, I would rather not put what I have in front of you, what I have on GitHub is going to work if you install it on your own local machine. Of course, keep in mind the number of dependencies, how much time that is going to take. If you only have a little bit of time, you want to get that feedback from them. So I'm not going to specify exactly what that looks like. That's something that you're going to have to figure out on a group by group basis of what does professionalism mean to you? What does that look like? How do you balance the different ways that you could present this project to the client? And it will be up to the client to figure out, was that professional or not? The other part of it, of course, is how intuitive is this to use? Is this what I asked for? And those will be the 10 points for the client meeting on the rubric. So that's only 10% of the sprint as a whole. But this is also where you will learn the requirements for sprint 2. Rather than all of it coming from me, like it did in sprint 1, it will actually come from the client. Client will say, hey, I actually want this now. I want this functionality. And given what the client wants, I am also going to give some functional, some technical requirements associated with how your project needs to work. The client doesn't know anything about the internals of the program, nor should they even think about it. Yeah.
So the professionalism and how we introduce ourselves and project to the client, is Tony gonna decide that how we work? Or
We're gonna have a discussion basically as we transition from one team to the next. Tony and I are gonna have a very brief 1-minute conversation. How did that go? And from there, I will take his input before I assign a final grade.
For Tony giving us things that he wants, is he gonna like be difficult and vague? And if so, are we gonna be able to ask clarifying questions throughout time, or is it like we meet with him, we have to program what he says, and then he's gonna say, that's not what I wanted, because that's the intention? Or am I able to go, hey, Tony, so give me more specifics on this piece, we're working on it right now.
I'll be able to clarify. I will know what the client wants. So I'm not gonna obfuscate or tell him to be especially vague. He will tell you what he wants, and then I will be able to further specify to make sure that it is clear. But I will not give you a document with that list of requirements. I may verbally be a little bit more vague, like, just so that everyone knows part of what's coming, you probably guessed this already, but there's going to be some kind of GUI, some kind of visual way to produce this UML. That is not the only thing happening in Sprint 2, but that is one of them. So I can talk a bit more in detail about what does it mean to have a graphical version of a UML. Other thoughts, other questions before we dive into a little bit of lecture? How are we feeling about the project? We feel like we'll at least have something bare bones and functional by Wednesday?
I think you can laughter.
Lots of laughter. I suppose we'll figure it out by Wednesday.
Oh, no, that's actually.
There's a lot here.
We still need to set up video.
There's a lot here. There's a lot to do. Even if you think it works going into Wednesday, you tested it with everybody else's code. You know that it works together. That's gonna be a reasonable chunk of the work. So if I'm on one of your teams, I'm pushing a little bit to, let's try to have everything, everyone's individual components finalized and up on GitHub to the best of your ability tomorrow night. So that we can spend a little bit of time Wednesday as needed to fix that. But even really, it should be midday tomorrow, so that if something goes wrong, you have time to make sure that functionality is at least there in a bare bones sense. Strip away some of the requirements, maybe you don't quite implement a couple of the more difficult things, but make sure that you're coming together, that you are actually merging your features into develop so that you can check them all out together well before that. And you will find some of the issues that need to be addressed, but you don't want to throw something in front of the client and just say, well, none of this works, but it works in principle. You want to at least have something that you can show them. All right, so last we were talking about code reviews, and I skipped to the end of this lecture to give you a sense of here's what code reviews look like for this class, so that you could get started with it. Remind you that everybody should be posting scrums every day this class meets, and I recommend posting them the days that the class does not meet, especially days that you get something done. So that you can check in with your team and make sure that you have the latest version of what they're working on. You know what everyone's doing. So we'll further come and justify some of these code reviews and talk about them a bit more in principle. And then the next unit we're covering this week is testing. We're going to move beyond unit testing to say, what does the entire testing framework of a large project look like? Yes, you can individually write unit tests for pieces of code, but when should tests be written? How many tests are enough? What kinds of testing do you do when you put all of these components together? How can you structure a program such that you're thinking about the tests before you even start? Things like that. In the meantime, though, why are we doing code reviews? So we want to minimize bust factors. We want to make sure that there are multiple people in your team that have seen every piece of code. We want people to have to justify what they are doing, so they're not just throwing stuff. They're not just coding willy-nilly. They're actually thinking about someone's going to be looking at this before it's part of my project. So I should make sure that it is coded to the best of my ability, that it's clean, that it's clear, because those are going to be the points of feedback that you get when your code reviewer actually looks at your code and says, yes or no, it's good enough. So let's look at some actual studies and look at defect detection rates for different kinds of testing and code reviews. As you might expect from having written your own unit tests can find about 1 in 4 actual bugs. If we were to take a 1,000-line piece of code and say, ask developers, write unit tests for this code. And in those 1,000 lines, maybe there are 100 bugs. we would expect unit testing to find about 25. We're gonna talk about some of these other testing types, functional testing and integration testing later on. There are some additional testing types that, when paired with unit testing, can help us to reduce bugs further. But it turns out that the absolute best thing that you can do is show your code to someone else. So if you inspect your design and you inspect your code, you can get up to 55 and 60% bug detection rate, which doesn't sound great. But when you're thinking, the biggest bugs are often the ones that are most apparent. The smallest bugs are the ones that stay hidden for years until you realize, oh, that actually doesn't quite what I thought it would produce, but it's close enough that it's fooled everybody from the inception of this program until right now. Those are the kinds of bugs that go hidden. So this is actually very good. And if you do all of these things, then you can see that you get kind of a multiplicative effect. As you get closer and closer and closer to finding all of the bugs. You're never actually going to get there. There will be bugs no matter what you do. So in industry, there are usually advanced tools that can help you to actually do those code reviews. There's an actual process built into it. So they integrate well with other changes or other systems that are needed. You can actually highlight the changes. You see this in something like a merge conflict, or when you do go to merge on Git, you'll see that there's green text for additions, red text for subtractions. I guess it's gone for subtract, black text, something. And then some text that says that there's a conflict of some kind. You can actually see diffs of, all right, some things were added here, some things were removed here that allow you to actually see the changes that were made visually. We have variations of our code reviews. There are different kind of levels that you can attack this at. We'll start with the code inspection. Is a formalized code review. So when you have an inspection, there are associated roles. And usually there aren't just two of them. There's an author, there's a reviewer, there's a scribe for someone who's taking notes about the review, and then there's a moderator that makes sure that you stay on track, that everyone is heard, that if there's a dispute between the author and the reviewer, the moderator will make the deciding vote about how do we move forward. Is this code acceptable or not? So you can make this as complicated as you need to make sure that it's efficient and that it adheres to all of the requirements. So several people looking at the same piece of code. So in code inspection, as deep as it gets, we have a checklist. There's some kind of documentation of what we're looking for that ensures that the reviewer is actually looking at each of these aspects of the code and saying yes or no to the aspects of the code, not just to the code itself. So focus on flaws that have been seen previously. We have some kind of history of a review. So if the reviewer has done this before, then they can look for the changes between the last time they reviewed this code and the current time they reviewed the code. You can focus on high risk areas. So you can focus a code inspection on something like, we're going to take the existing project and take a look at it from a security perspective. Coming up with, here are all of the defects that I think this code has. Here are all the points of attack that I don't think we've 100% covered. So that's the inspection. A walkthrough, more informal than the inspection. And just some discussion between the author and a single reviewer. There's no deliverable from a walkthrough, but it forces the author to actually talk about the code that they've written. To say, kind of rubber duck to a real person. And that way the real person can respond to this. A code reading is just a single person activity. Reviewers looking at the code by themselves, maybe with a meeting, maybe with no meeting. This is really rubber ducking. Does everyone have a rubber duck that they use for debugging? Raise your hand if you do. If you don't, you should get one. It's a very solid investment.
You got like 17 voices up here, you're fine.
But if my personality is a rubber duck, I'm great.
More like the Green Gauntlet mask. I'm like programming and it's in the corner of my mind, be like, you'll never amount to anything, stop. You're nothing without me.
Imagine the Willem Dafoe.
Yeah. Fucking straight. My rubber duck is probably balanced. Yes. Oh, injection, do it.
I like mine just some ops, hey, if it's good enough for you, it's good enough for me.
So we'll end this, I think, by looking, I don't know if it's exactly the last thing that I wanna cover, but I wanna take a look at some quotes from developers at actual companies to talk about how do code reviews work at those companies. So, quote from Amanda Camp at Google: all code that gets submitted needs to be reviewed by at least one other person. Either the code writer or the reviewer need to have readability in that language. That gets at a term that we haven't really talked about. At a company, you will have readability and writability in different languages. You don't necessarily have to have that same overlap, but it tells you what roles you can play in code reviews at that company. If you have readability in Python, that means that you can review Python code that someone else has written. If you have writability, then you can be on a project where the outcome is writing Python. Most people use Mondrian to do code reviews, and we spend a good chunk of our time reviewing code. So regardless of how high up this goes, this is not a waste of time. The biggest companies are spending a significant part of development time and resources reviewing code. And that tells us that it is worth it. Even for people who work for those companies. So even if you're a developer who's been developing for years, tens of years, you still go through this process of reviewing code because it's necessary and it's still worth it, even with all of that experience. So if those developers are going through it, then everybody in this room should also be going through it, because I don't know if any of us hold ourselves quite yet to be at the standard of people who have been working at Google for 10 or 20 years. Why not? Yelp. Alan Feinberg says, at Yelp, we use a review board. An engineer works on a branch and commits the code to their own branch. The reviewer then goes through the diff, adds inline comments on the review board, and sends them back. The reviews are meant to be a dialogue, so typically comment threads result from the feedback. Once the reviewer's questions and concerns are all addressed, they'll click ship it, and the office will merge it with the main branch for deployment the same day. This sounds pretty similar to a good process that we would like to be able to simulate or emulate in this class. So any changes that are suggested by a code reviewer, don't take it personally. It's meant to be a dialogue. Start to talk back and forth. Why do you think that? How will this help this in this regard? You want to start becoming on the same page as the rest of your teammates about how do we write clear code? How do we write bug-free code to whatever extent that's actually possible? What kind of gamer would I be without talking about Wizards of the Coast? At Wizards, we use Perforce for SCM. I work with stuff that manages rules and content, so we try to commit changes at the granularity of one bug at a time or one card at a time. Our team is small enough that you can designate one other person on the team as a code reviewer. Usually you look at code sometime that week, but it depends on priority. It's impossible to write sufficient test harnesses for the bulk of our main code, so code reviews are absolutely crucial. And if anyone has ever tried to play Magic the Gathering Online, the sheer number of rules and code that needs to be in place to make sure that every card interacts with every other card in the appropriate way. Those are ridiculously complicated rules that have very strange side cases. You have judges at professional events because people who are professional, actually pros, will get into a state where they don't know how something resolves. What happens here? They'll have a disagreement about what happens, and a judge will have to come preside and say, this is what happens here. Because they're an expert in the system. The code base needs to be that judge for every possible case that could develop in interactions between tens of thousands of cards. So you can imagine the level of code review that needs to happen between people who are just writing code, people who know the rules of the game, people who have played the game for a long time, and people who have designed the game and really interacted with the complexities of the rules of the probably most complicated card game ever made. At Facebook, we collect everybody's data.
I've noticed.
And then sell it. You are the product. At Facebook, we have an internally developed web-based tool that aids the code review process. Once an engineer has prepared a change, she commits it to this tool, which will notify the person or people she has asked to review the change, along with others that may be interested in the change, such as people who have worked on a function that got changed. At this point, the reviewers can make comments, ask questions, request changes, or accept the changes. If changes are requested, the submitter must submit a new version of the change to be reviewed. All versions submitted are retained, so reviewers can compare the change to the original or just changes from the last version was reviewed. Once a change has been submitted, the engineer can merge her change into the main source tree for deployment to the site during the next weekly push or earlier if the change warrants a release. All of this sounds like Git flow. So this is industry standard for development. Everything that I am trying to teach, trying to get you to do in this project is something that will be useful as you go to try to find jobs in this field. So what needs to be done precisely? I'm at this point just looking for code reviews are happening, but I really want them to start being very structured. So document the code review in some fashion. If this is an email thread, make note of the fact that this is how it was documented. If you use the checklist that's the end of the slide deck, have some documentation that a code review happened. Again, I don't need to see that review necessarily, I just need to know that it happened. The exact structure of the review is up to you. I recommend doing something in between the walkthrough and the inspection, so something that is detailed but not so detailed that you need to bring everyone from your group into every single review. 2 people should be enough. But make sure that you're doing it at a level where you have structure to that review. It's not just someone who's coming in and reading code and saying yes or no, but make sure they have some kind of checklist. Make sure that they're looking for everything that is important. Don't review truly trivial code, but do note that that threshold for trivial is probably lower than you would think. And that just means that if it's a single line of code, and that line of code is a print statement, does not need a review. We all know how to print things.
That's what you think.
If it's 3 lines, maybe there's something that needs a review in there. It could be a very quick review. Make sure you're going through that review process. There tends to be a lot of pushback to code reviews, amongst novice developers or people in software engineering classes. So I'm going to present to you some counter arguments from whiny students. And your task will be to respond saying why, help coach them. So I don't like doing a code review of every commit. It takes too long. I want to make lots of commits and it slows me down. we were to hear something like that, what are your counter arguments? I don't know why I made students sound like gremlins.
I'm not allowed to
That's
say.
not how I view you. Thoughts?
Yeah, I'd probably say, get out.
How is that not a command in Git? Get out.
Get dash arrow.
Yeah, kicks person from repository.
Who said?
Other thoughts? Yeah,
I don't know, it's, the most immediate thought is just like, well, why don't you just focus on the most important stuff? You don't need to skim over like everything, what's the most important thing? It's like, I don't know, I guess to go on like the trivial thing.
so let's address this. I want to make lots of commits, and it slows me down. What does that mean? How can you address that?
Yeah, that was my biggest issue, is like, why are you making a bunch of commits and not making commits based upon actual updates to the project? A commit should be actual points where you got something changed, significantly changed or working that I actually need to review to make sure it's in line with everything.
Yeah,
You
a
can
commit
just-
has a message associated with it, right? You cannot commit unless you write a message for that commit.
Like, unless you're committing for almost every single minor change you make, you shouldn't be making tons of commits at a time.
Are you sure that every one of those lines that you wrote is perfect, complete, and is ready to be added to the remote repository? Yeah, by the time you commit something, you should have something ready to join, like complete, as you say. It should be, even if it's not an entire feature, it should be, I wrote a method, I wrote some small piece of functionality that is now complete, that I can now store on the remote repository. So, too many commits. If you have trouble thinking of a commit message, do more work until the commit message is obvious. I finished this, I added this functionality, I changed this mistake that I found. This bug's been fixed. There's something meaningful you can say there. I will be looking through commits for garbage messages. Every message should be meaningful. Please make sure that the commits you're making have a purpose. Even if that purpose is to undo a mistake that you made, that's a purpose. Not just garbage, blah. How many commit messages? This is a commit message. Useful. Other thoughts?
So, yeah, and this one it says to review, so it slows me down. If the code is not correct, that will slow down the person,
Yes.
not the review.
Yes, it's not about how much code you are writing, it's about the length of time between now and when you are done. And a code review will save more time than not reviewing that code. In some way, shape, or form, at some point in the future. Even if it's 2 years from now, a developer comes on the project, has to look at this file for the first time, and it's not documented, so that's gonna take them more time than it would have taken to review the code, make it clear so that person can onboard. Yeah.
Keyword slows me down. Not them.
Yeah, right, that's a very me-centered terminology and not a group-centered terminology, that's another great point. So responses, possibly making too many commits, you want to make sure that your commits are coherent and complete changes to the code base, not very tiny changes or work that is still incomplete. If something is really quick to write or a small change, it should be quick to review. If you check in buggy code, you'll lose more time eventually than it would have taken to code review it and find the bug. All right. Number 2, we tried doing code reviews, but it wasn't useful. We never find any bugs or errors, the code is just always improved. So this makes me think that the reviewer is not thorough enough. There are always, almost always, some issues to find in some way, shape, or form. It may not even be in the performance of the code, it may be in the clarity, it may be in unnecessarily long statements. If this equals true. Unnecessary, if this Boolean. Sometimes the point is not to find flaws and fix them, but to make sure that another developer is familiar with the code. Right? Bus factor, just the fact that someone else looked at that code at that point can help alleviate future concerns. In fact, the original coder knew we review increases the chance that they wrote better code to start with. So there may be some causality in this. If it's always approved, it's because you knew that a code review was coming. Let's actually do an example. Here we go. Some Java code. Take the role of the code reviewer and make some suggestions to this code. This is gonna take a little while, yeah.
Needs comments.
Certainly needs some comments. Yes, absolutely. Let's take about 5 minutes, come up with a bulleted list of just what, if you were doing this code review. What suggestions would you make? And let's see if we can be as thorough as possible here to try to produce the best overall code that we could. This doesn't even have to be individual. Feel free to talk to a neighbor, talk to a couple neighbors, people in your group. We'll put the list together.
I guess because they're all street. Yeah, spaced out, like double the full rate, spaced out, INT, or day exactly, account lag, spaced out. So same thing with that. Just a public, that should at least be spaced out. Oh, let's see here. I don't know what else to. Can you use counter object?
Okay, right now, that.
I get it's probably like
they think supposed to be static.
I think it would be easy to have any static going.
No,
The only one that's
Whatever have you done, yes. And I'm, because the stuff you're working on, you go mark that you're working on. Wait, no, it's changed.
That's
Sorry. And then I'll add that to the. So you can have all the issues on the, now, I like my signs, people that were already signed. Like, I know you're working on. The interface. Yeah. As well.
I see.
But then I added all of them to the issues or. So now you'll just go here and you'll add yourself as a pretty here. Like for like the last week, you go sign each, and you can assign yourself. And then you can assign infra.
And I'm guilty that too, I forgot about it, Discord, where else we're.
Yeah, so it's not, you're on there now, so now we can get those both updated, you know, work on, see if we don't have anything being worked on.
It's like, I don't know, it's account type, but.
Oh, it doesn't.
Just at the first state, like I don't know the exact one. Okay.
Right there. Maybe that's not the very.
Okay, that might actually.
Yeah, static means like you can't change it, right? And final means like it's final, like it's. Okay, final, and static.
A lot of mainline breaks, for example, that last one, count.
Hey, you know, What does engineer review, what data?
A static means you don't like. You don't have to create an object with the class in order to use it.
Okay,
So you don't have to call the account, my account, it's your account, right? You can just call the class name or account. So you don't have to go. Creation model.
okay, gotcha. It's kind of like, there's something like, is there something like some kind of mistake? I'm not really-
Let's come together and see if we can identify how to Best ideas. What are some issues with this code? So we mentioned comments before. Comments is good. That is one of the elements that is sorely lacking. There are two bad comments here, but let's start. 1, 2, 3. Before writing it up. 1, 2, 3.
Yeah. It's like two of those constants aren't even used. Standard budget.
Yeah, standard budget, premium plus. We have some static kind of constants up here that we're not really using. Right? Account not, I mean, we're using premium plus here, we're using, yeah, there are a couple of them that aren't used. Maybe they're used in other methods here, but at least not right here. This were the only thing that we would wonder, what are those for? Sure.
To kind of go off that, if they are using it in different ones, then they might want to do like an if else statement. Or like add an if else statement to account for standard and budget, because I bet you those are gonna be different prices than a premium or premium plus. I'd also say indentions, just so then the code looks more readable.
Yeah, indenting.
And then also, yeah, like how you said, just removing the comments from within parentheses in code. It's never really readable.
Good, yeah.
The biggest thing I want to specify is, okay, so why are you returning a static double out of this? Is my biggest question. The static means it's gonna sit in the memory of the entire runtime of this program. And if you run this program a lot, that's a lot of wasted memory space allocating to a bunch of data you return. So why does it need to be static?
Okay. Yeah, if something is static, then it has a single value across, or a single cell of memory across all instantiated objects. They all refer to the same value. So if one changes it, then it changes it for all of them. It's a good point, yeah.
That's why I'll highly suggest to refactor this class into a enumerated class.
Yes. So when you have something like this, where you have a bunch of static class constants, it might be nice to make it Great idea. What else?
I'm not sure if anybody already this, but it says total P. Plus equals all that, might be way easier to break that to like separate steps, instead of just having like a.
One big expression, yeah, kind of do it piecewise to make it a little bit easier to see what the methods are for that. There's another big issue that hasn't been pointed out at all yet.
Is it like,
Yeah.
Is it how they space the names, like the design is not consistent?
Yeah, we have space equals here, I think is what I was thinking of, but absolutely, that is another one that hasn't been mentioned yet, that is certainly a concern. There should be some standard that you will all code to, and this will be different depending on where you work. Some company may say all code written must adhere to this particular standard. You have to throw away how you have historically done something to make sure that you are writing code to somebody else's standards. So it's very good practice to come up with some standard for your group and then try to adhere to that for all the code that you write. What's left? Pretty annoying issue from my perspective. Why, there are two, there's an annoying issue and a massive vulnerability.
I don't know if that's like a error.
The issue is that we have constant values in here that I loathe. Do not write numbers like this in your code. If it's something that means something, factor it out into a class constant, give it a name. What does this 365.25 represent? You have to use intuition to say, all right, this is the average number of days that there are in a year, leap year included. That's something that has no documentation anywhere in your code, which means that two different people can interpret what this means differently. You can think that, oh, it's just obvious, but isn't to everyone who might be interfacing with this. So much better to say, year, and have year be a constant that is defined up there to be a particular value. The really big vulnerability, these are all public.
Oh, yeah,
That's really bad. Any code anywhere can change these values. That's probably not great. So, big things. You can turn that code into this. Here we have much better comments. Here we have an actual enum type rather than class constants that are tied to integers that have no meaning. We can see now that we separate it's easy to tell what are the fields. We can see what the fields do. We can see that we have a compounded rate, it goes all into the comments. And then we took this massive interest and we took out this interest part of this into its own method. So that we see that it's so much easier to read. We've renamed it to something that makes sense. We've turned it into something piecewise, as was also mentioned, that is just a few lines long and refers to everything that makes sense. There's still this annoying class constant that needs to go, but that's just me. Is this easier to read? Is this easier to parse? I think a lot of novice programmers tend to write like this. I see this a lot. If this is difficult for you to read when you didn't write it, it's difficult for anyone else to read something that you did write. So think about a code review turning something that's gross like this into something like this. And it's so much easier to see what this does at a glance. There's the second part. Of course, this didn't get tabbed over correctly, but it's a lot easier to see, it's a lot easier to read, it's just in general better. Questions? I'm gonna start a new unit 1 minute to go in class. So I think we will come back tomorrow and start talking about testing. I will be in my office for the next at least an hour. If you have any concerns about the project, want to talk about how things are going, work out a better design together. I have availability to help you to the best you can. I recommend coming up with a communication plan and a work plan for between now and Wednesday. Wednesday represents the best work, you can find that.